Hi, my name's Nick Wilson, and with my colleague Matt Boyd, we've been looking at catastrophes and island nations. So, first of all, one of the areas we've looked at is islands and border control to exclude extreme pandemics. And historically, there's evidence that this has worked for the 1918 influenza pandemic with a number of Pacific nations. But also, these Pacific nations were often quite successful in keeping the COVID-19 pandemic out, often for at least 2 years. And there's three Pacific nations that still have had no COVID cases due to successful border control. And successful examples of COVID-19 elimination have actually occurred in a number of Pacific nations as well, with repeated elimination, though these three nations have all actually failed to exclude the Omicron variant. We've actually published a paper that looked at different islands as refuges against extreme pandemics, with some of them having relatively high scores on this index: Australia, New Zealand, Iceland, and Japan, for example. But also, islands may be good for improving survival chances after sun-blocking catastrophes. These include nuclear winter scenarios, extreme volcanic events, and asteroid impacts. And that's partly because of the well-known thermal moderating effect of the ocean. But also some of these nations have excess food production capacity, and obviously they have access typically to marine food resources. So looking at this more closely, we've got some work underway with the Effective Altruism's Long-Term Future Fund, and we've looked at 38 island nations for which there's information about nuclear winter scenarios and data on dietary energy production. And this suggests after a very severe nuclear winter scenario with 150 megatons of soot in the stratosphere, five of these islands would still have capacity, food production capacity to feed all their populations. In fact, Australia has such vast production capacity that it would still have a large reserve of food energy production, enough to actually feed millions of refugees. And even in other nuclear winter scenarios, there'd be some other island nations that could also have this energy production capacity. But it's important to note that there's enormous uncertainty around all these nuclear winter impacts. There's also historical evidence around a real sun-blocking event, the Tambora eruption of 1815. And we've looked at how islands did compared to other continental land masses. And it does seem a general picture that islands around continental Europe did a bit better in terms of temperature and precipitation anomalies. Similarly for North and East Asia and some islands around North America. So we've also looked at within the islands that were impacted by Tambora. Most of these islands did experience altered climate and about half reduced food production. Some even had food riots and increased death rates. The worst impacts were for Great Britain and Ireland. Some islands had only a small climate impact, Japanese islands, Taiwan, and so on. And there's some islands where tree ring and other historical data show actually no significant climate impact. Overall, the pattern was suggestive that islands in the Pacific did better than those in the Atlantic. So the idea of islands as nodes of persisting complexity has been proposed, and King and Jones in their publication did identify a short list of 5 islands: New Zealand, Iceland, UK, Tasmania, and Ireland. And in fact, if you look at Australia, as I mentioned, it's got vast food production overcapacity and also energy self-sufficiency. It's got a strong utility sector, and it actually can make things like vaccines and pharmaceuticals. And Taiwan is another example of a very high technology island, and it's a global leader in the semiconductor industry. But planning for island refuges has really got some big challenges. Island nation governments often don't consider any of these issues. And New Zealand's an example where its risk register is classified and its documents about the long-term future ignore completely issues like nuclear war. Generally, there's efficiency is prioritised over expanding resilience, and there's a lack of knowledge about what are the critical components needed to sustain things like the internet and telecommunications. And also a lack of understanding about how to maximise social cohesion and minimise disinformation after catastrophes. And we've seen a number of countries like Australia and New Zealand still had riots associated with COVID-19 pandemic responses, even though they performed pretty well. So to conclude, island nations can succeed with border control to keep out extreme pandemics. We've seen historical evidence of this. Islands might do better in terms of surviving sun-blocking catastrophes such as nuclear winter, and Australia is an example of extreme food self-sufficiency. And there's some real-world data from the Tambora eruption that favours island nations, especially those in the Pacific. But there's actually very large challenges still about how to plan such refuges, and island governments typically don't seem to be acknowledging these risks and adequately investing in technological and social resilience. Thank you. Happy to answer questions.
Great, thank you. Oh, great. Okay, well, I found that absolutely fascinating. Yeah. Do we want to go Tom, and maybe a quick one for others? Maybe not.
Hi, Nick. Tom here from the Daily Telegraph in the UK. Could you assess the UK's viability as an island nation in those respects, please?
Yes, well, the UK actually doesn't seem to think of itself much as an island. It's sort of connected with a tunnel as well. And certainly with the COVID response, it didn't seem to take any serious measures to keep out COVID. So I think there's a sort of a conceptual problem there. But also, it is very close to the European continent. So in events like a nuclear winter, it would be influenced by continental climate. And we saw that with Tambora. It did suffer quite a lot from that climate change event. And its weather was influenced by the European continent. But in other ways, the UK is technologically relatively advanced, though it doesn't have significant food self-sufficiency. I think it's highly dependent on imports. So generally, island refuges are probably better to think about those in the Pacific and further away from continental land masses.